Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Smith, and I'm currently a doctoral candidate in the Educational Technology program at Boise State University. This presentation will guide you through my dissertation research on synchronous online peer tutoring via video conferencing, an exploratory case study. Let's take a look. I want to first start out by talking about the background of how this study came about. At the time I started developing the idea, I was serving as the director of distance education for a local community college. At the time, we had an on-campus peer tutoring program that was very strong. But one of the things we were in the process of doing is we were trying to increase our online program and course offerings. In doing so, SAC-COC has a requirement that basically states if you offer online courses and programs, you have to ensure that the same services that are available to on-campus students are available to your online students. We had to come up with a solution to provide online peer tutoring services that were comparable to the services offered to those who were on campus. So our next idea was to start looking internally at what we could do. That led me to explore and research other institutions that were trying the same thing. I came across Old Dominion University. Old Dominion University started exploring online peer tutoring programs because of the same SAC-COC requirement that I just discussed. As a result, they started out with an initial program where they looked at or used Smart Thinking, which is a third-party commercial service, and this was done through a grant. It worked for a little bit, but they weren't seeing really good numbers, and as the grant came to an end, they too were not able to sustain the same cost that was involved in the program. So they began to develop the internal online peer tutoring program, which is the program that was studied for this dissertation. And we're going to talk more about that as we go through this presentation. This leads us to the statement of the problem. Distance education enrollments in higher education have continued to grow while face-to-face enrollments have declined. From 2013 to 2014, the number of students that took at least one distance education course increased to 3.9%, while the number of students not taking distance education courses dropped during that same time span. Allen et al. 2016. While the convenience of being able to learn anytime, any place has led to increased online enrollments, online learners have also reported feelings of disconnect from vital student and academic support services such as library resources and tutoring services. Burns et al. 2014. This is where SACS realized there was a problem, and so they instituted some guidelines that institutions must follow. And within those guidelines, institutions are required to make available to distance education students the same student, academic, and administrative support services that are available to traditional on-campus students. Tutoring is one of the academic support services that is discussed within the SAC-COC distance education guidelines. Because of the comparable student and academic services requirement put in place by SAC-COC, many institutions have begun exploring ways for offering tutoring services online. Park and Kim 2016. While research has shown that asynchronous and synchronous online tutoring have both been shown to have a positive impact on student learning, Wu, Lin, and Yang 2013 found there is little understanding of how peer tutors and their tutees experience online tutoring environments. That leads us to the purpose of this study. The purpose of this study was to explore the experiences of peer tutors, the types of interactions that occur between peer tutors and their tutees, instructional strategies, and adjustments in instructional strategies that occur in the synchronous online peer tutoring environment. There are two theories that help to shape the framework for this study. The first is role theory. Basically, role theory shows that different individuals assume roles in particular settings. And so in the setting of this study, peer tutors actually assume the role of a teacher. And so as they assume that role, they begin taking on responsibilities of locating supplementary materials, of thinking of different instructional strategies to use to try to help their 2Ds understand. And so role theory focuses on the ability of the individual or initial role player, or the peer tutor in this case, to predict the behavior of other role players, which are the 2Ds, to adjust his or her own actions and behaviors to accommodate the needs of the 2Ds. And that's Beidel 2013. The second theory that was used to form the framework for this study is social cognitive theory by Bandura. Bandura introduced the concept of social learning theory, which began a paradigm shift from behavioral focus to a cognitive learning focus. And basically what this theory says is that social modeling has an influence on human motivation. And so, according to Bandura, one of the key elements associated with social cognitive theory relevant to this study is modeling, which involves the use of modeling lessons or activities to build competency mastery, stronger self-confidence, and increased self-motivation. So the peer tutors use those skills to help build confidence in their 2Ds. And so together, role theory and social cognitive theory form the theoretical framework for this study. The following research questions were used to complete this study. There was one central research question and then 3 sub-questions. Research methods used. A qualitative research approach was used for this study in order to gather information about the lived experiences of the peer tutors as they interact with the 2Ds in the synchronous online tutoring environment. Cresswell talked about qualitative research and the need for the central phenomenon. The central phenomenon in this study was the perceptions of peer tutors who provide synchronous online peer tutoring services to students enrolled at the host institution. This exploratory qualitative study used a case study approach to further investigate the perceptions of peer tutors as they use video conferencing technology to provide synchronous online tutoring services. Case studies are used in qualitative research to allow researchers to further investigate the effects of complex interventions as they are applied to individuals, groups of people, relationships, communities, and other programs. Data collection. To investigate the lived experiences of peer tutors, semi-structured interviews were conducted with the peer tutors. Semi-structured interviews allow the researcher to add additional probing questions into the interviews based on participant responses, whereas structured interviews do not allow that freedom. Recordings of the peer tutoring sessions were reviewed and analyzed to validate information provided by the peer tutors during the face-to-face interviews and identify additional concepts that might not have been discussed in the initial interviews. Finally, journaling was used in the form of field notes to make additional notes as I went through each of the interview transcripts and observations to make additional notes about visual cues that were seen in terms of facial expressions or reactions, along with different audio cues. And we're going to learn more about that in the coming slides. So we're going to move on to data analysis. And so to begin with, I personally transcribed verbatim each of the interviews. The recordings from the interviews and from the observations were all transcribed. And then as I transcribed those, I began to do some initial coding where I started to make notes of different things I saw along the way before I got into the official coding process, which was a 2-cycle process. First, I used in vivo coding for the first cycle, and basically this is where you just basically take out certain phrases or things that were said. In this particular instance, I primarily focused on pulling out first all the questions that were asked by the peer tutors throughout each session. So I pulled the whole question in quotes and I set up a table in Excel and added that in there. Once I pulled those out, I went back through a second round of coding and used focus coding to pull those different quotes and items that I pulled out directly into more categorically or thematically organized groups. And so I used both those cycles of coding to analyze the data for this study. In table 4.1, you'll see that there's data for the spring 2017 academic semester and for the fall 2017 academic semester. Spring to fall, these two semesters were the main academic semesters where I was gathering data for this study. The interviews started near the end of the spring academic semester, and then I was collecting recordings all the way through the middle to end of the fall 2017 academic semester. But the important piece of this table I want to point out is that they started with 9 unique tutors who offered online tutoring services in spring 2017, and there were 13 in the fall of 2017. I bring that number up because that's going to lead us into the participants for this study. So all 9 peer tutors who served in the spring of 2017 agreed to participate in this study, and of those 9, 4 were female and 5 were male. They participated in a peer tutoring training program, all the peer tutors at Old Dominion University do, not just the online tutors, that's put together by the CRLA. CRLA stands for College Reading and Learning Association. It's an internationally recognized organization that has led the way to improving guidelines for designing and evaluating peer tutor training programs. 8 of the 9 had at least 2 prior semesters of online tutoring experience, and a variety of subjects were represented, including engineering, calculus, physics, statistics, business, Spanish, biology, chemistry, computer science, a variety of topics. And finally, 6 of the 9 peer tutors were able to be observed, and we're going to talk about that discrepancy later on when we talk about the limitations of this study. So, a synthesis of the interview and observation results. Table 4.8 provides an alignment of the interview and observation questions to the research question. So in the next few slides, I want to go through more specific findings from each of those research sub-questions. So we're going to start with sub-question number 1. Finding number 1 is that they ask questions. A variety of questions were asked throughout this study, and those questions were grouped into 5 main categories, or 5 types. There were a total of 231 individual questions asked throughout the course of the 6 synchronous online peer tutoring sessions that were observed. Those questions were used to check for clarity, define terms, establish baseline knowledge, or understand a process. Most of the questions that were asked were classified as general questions. Next, finding number 1.2 was answering 2D questions. The peer tutors were not always the ones asking the questions. At times, the 2Ds were asking questions. There were 2 different specific times when 2Ds would ask questions. First, it would happen when they didn't specifically understand something that the tutor had said, and so they would ask additional questions to clarify meaning. Other times, they would actually lead the conversation. That would help move from one topic to the next. Finding 1.3 talked about describing specific concepts. When the peer tutors were not asking or answering questions, there were times where they were describing specific concepts. The final finding from research sub-question number 1 was that there were sometimes communication issues. Most of the time, these had to do with the 2Ds not being able to successfully get logged into the WebEx software or not being able to connect their audio. But there were times along the way where this happened because of technology failures, whether it be network or hardware failures. That takes us to research sub-question number 2. First, finding 2.1 talks about probing questions. They're trained in the peer tutor training at the beginning of each semester to ask a variety of questions. And so they ask 2 main types. They ask open-ended questions or they ask yes-no questions. And those questions were used to solicit information from the 2Ds to help determine if the content was actually being comprehended. They also have to, as finding 2.2 says, interpret audio and visual cues along the way. Now, not all peer tutors were able to use visual cues because not all of the peer tutors actually used their video cameras in the session, and not all of the 2Ds used their cameras. Only 2 peer tutors of the 6 that were observed used the video feature. But all peer tutors and 2Ds are required to use the audio feature. So they have to, those that don't use video have to listen very carefully for different cues to determine when the 2Ds do not understand or are having trouble with the content that's being discussed. That leads us to research sub-question number 3. Finding 3.3 talks about supplementary materials. One of the things that was observed is that the peer tutors had a wealth of information that they had obtained from having previously taken these courses that they were tutoring with or tutoring in. They had past notes and textbooks. They had websites that they'd used. They knew how the professors on campus taught and ran the courses, and they were able to bring in those items and tie those things together to help provide the 2Ds with the services that were needed. The other thing is that scaffolding was used throughout the course of each tutoring session. Scaffolding is an instructional strategy where you take a big complex concept and you start small. You break it into small pieces and you work your way through each concept till you get up to that larger overriding concept. And so each of the peer tutors handled scaffolding different ways, but they all used a different type of scaffolding to get from 2D misunderstanding to 2D understanding. Next, I want to talk about the assertions that were made from the data analysis. And so I have table 5.1 as another alignment table that talks about each research question and the assertions that were made based on that research question. Each of the research questions had 2 different assertions that were made. So I'm going to start with sub-question 1. Assertion number 1 talks about how synchronous online peer tutors communicate with 2Ds verbally and visually. The Synchronous Online Peer Tutoring Program at ODU is a good example of a program that was originally designed to support a growing population of students who are enrolling in distance education courses. The program, originally intended for online students since the fall of 2016, has expanded to offer additional academic support to the entire student body at ODU. The online peer tutoring program operates through WebEx video conferencing technology, which offers individual and group text chat features, audio communication, screen sharing capabilities, and video interaction. Assertion number 2 talks about how peer tutors ask questions, answer questions, and describe concepts. All Old Dominion University peer tutors go through a rigorous peer tutor training program that was developed based on materials obtained from the CRLA. Through reviewing the observation recordings, it was obvious that each of the peer tutors who were observed, and even in the interviews, they talked about how well they really utilized the information that they were given in that peer tutor training on how to ask specific questions, how to provide answers to questions without giving the answers to the problem, and how to describe concepts. Research question, sub-question number 2. Assertion number 3 talks about the use of probing questions to assess 2D understanding. The research talked, Shepard et al. 2005, talked about how peer tutors throughout the duration of each peer tutoring session use various formative assessment questions to adapt instructional practices along the way. And so in observing the 6 peer tutors that I got to see in action, they really use these strategies to help guide the online peer tutoring sessions. There were times where they would actually come up with formative assessment type questions that would dig deeper to find out. They would kind of backtrack and go back and look at some of the items that they knew were important to the topic before they got to where the 2Ds were actually asking questions. And so they really use these probing questions in positive ways to assess 2D understanding. And then assertion number 4 talks about how tutors rely on verbal and visual cues to assess 2D understanding. This is where they really took advantage of the active listening and paraphrasing training that they received as part of the peer tutor training program at Old Dominion University. They took advantage of audio and video tools that were available inside of WebEx video conferencing software to communicate with their tutees in real time. And so they used the visual cues and really had to listen a lot of times for auditory cues to determine next steps with each 2D. So we'll move on to research sub-question number 3. Synchronous online peer tutors use scaffolding techniques to improve 2D comprehension. McDonald 2000 found that peer tutors should be equipped and prepared with a variety of effective instructional strategies for peer tutoring sessions to be successful. One example he gave describes scaffolding, which is the process where peer tutors assess 2D prior knowledge, remove more difficult tasks, and incrementally provide more challenging information until the 2D understands. 5 peer tutors discussed using various scaffolding techniques during their interviews, and all 6 were observed using some form of scaffolding during the observation piece. Assertion number 6 talks about the use of supplemental resources to improve 2D comprehension. The importance of the criteria here was that students who serve as peer tutors were students at the same college as their 2Ds and had already completed the same courses with many of the same professors that the 2Ds were seeking help with. As a result, peer tutors had access to a plethora of supplemental resources from the previous courses, such as textbooks, handouts, released test questions, and external websites, along with additional insight into each specific professor's teaching habits and expectations. There were 4 main limitations to this study. First is that scheduled synchronous online peer tutoring sessions occur. They do still have trouble with no-shows and sessions getting canceled, so there are low numbers of sessions that actually occur. The number of peer tutors who provide online peer tutoring services. As I previously described, there were 9 total peer tutors available. In the spring of 2017, I was able to interview all 9 of those. They agreed to participate. However, along the way, 2 found alternative employment and have left the program. And another one, there were 3 total that I was not able to get observation data from because of number 3, the willingness of 2Ds to participate in the study. The observation piece required permission from the peer tutors and from the 2Ds. And so I was able to get real easily permission to access the recordings, but I also had to get permission from the 2Ds. Those were sent out on a regular 2-week basis by Old Dominion administrators. However, students, the 2Ds, didn't really respond to that too well, and so we had trouble getting responses from the 3 peer tutors who I was not able to observe. Finally, the last limitation was WebEx recordings of online peer tutoring sessions. All sessions are required to be recorded by Old Dominion University. However, there is no automatic recording setting. The peer tutors have to remember to push the record button. Sometimes they would forget or get halfway through the session and remember. Other times they would record it and they would get an email saying it was recorded, but they would fail to send that email to the administrators of the peer tutor center. And so there were some recordings that were lost in those processes. Recommendations for future practice. Overall, the peer tutors who chose to participate in this study were excited to know that additional research was being done to see how the current online peer tutoring program at Old Dominion University might be improved. They were also excited to know that this research would be shared with other institutions that might be considering starting a similar synchronous online peer tutoring program or who have already implemented a similar program and might be looking to implement or improve their current practices. All 9 peer tutors were anxious to hear more about the results of the study to help improve their own tutoring practices. 2 main findings were identified because of this study that need to be taken into consideration when developing or revising similar synchronous online peer tutoring programs. First, additional technical training is needed for both the peer tutors and their 2Ds. Second, additional technical support options are needed for peer tutors who experience problems with hardware tools not working properly. Addressing these 2 main concerns would decrease peer tutor and 2D frustration and allow more time to be spent on addressing and solving academic needs as opposed to troubleshooting communication and technology issues. Finally, to summarize and conclude, perceptions associated with peer tutor training. The first major finding of this study was that peer tutor communication and interaction with tutees differs based on individual peer tutor academic and technical skill sets. Through lived experiences, each of the 6 peer tutors who were observed in this study have learned to adapt to make up for shortcomings that were identified in the online portion of the peer tutoring training program. While there are some improvements that can be made to the current peer tutoring training program, like showing the peer tutors the different options that are available through sharing printed materials, digital websites, whiteboards, 2D screen sharing, no 2 peer tutors are going to tutor the same way. Like college professors who teach the same courses in higher education, every teacher has his or her unique way of communicating, interacting, instructing, reinforcing, and remediating students. Peer tutors have their own personal preferences for carrying out the responsibility of tutoring other students. Personality influences and adaptations are not something that can be taught. Instead, they are developed over the course of a peer tutor's entire school career. Increasing technical support for peer tutors and their tutees. The second major finding was that the need for additional technical support for peer tutors and their tutees to be provided. All too often, the peer tutors find themselves having to troubleshoot technical issues with their own technology or with the audio and video technology of their tutees. Rather than spending valuable tutoring time trying to solve hardware connection issues, peer tutors and tutees need to be provided with additional technical support, such as step-by-step how-to guides on how to address the frequent connectivity problems and possibly a technical support hotline. This would allow the peer tutors to focus the teaching aspect of online tutoring rather than how to fix broken issues. Improving scheduling and preparation for peer tutors. The third and final major finding was that the peer tutors are spending a good deal of time in the beginning of each peer tutor session just trying to figure out exactly what each tutee needs assistance with. Synchronous online peer tutoring program needs to find ways to better assist the peer tutors with being prepared for each tutoring session. In conclusion, while the results of this study identified changes that need to be made in the online portion of the peer tutor training program, such as increased technical support and improved scheduling and preparation for peer tutors as possible areas of improvement, ultimately the synchronous online peer tutoring sessions appeared to be successful. In all 6 synchronous online peer tutoring sessions that were reviewed, the tutees who participated in those sessions were heard thanking the peer tutors for their time and the help that was provided. All the tutees were also heard discussing the scheduling of additional online peer tutoring sessions soon. Data collected during the interviews and the observations revealed that all 9 peer tutors were very passionate about the role they serve as peer tutors, and helping others achieve academic success was a common passion shared by all participants in this study.